The morning the Duke of Wexford came home, he found the grate in his wife's sitting room still warm, full of black curled ash that had once been his own handwriting. Eleanor was gone, her trunks gone, her side of the bed smooth as a frozen pond, and on the mantel sat the only thing she had not burned, her locked diary, turned to face the door, as if she had wanted him to find it and be unable to open it. Adrian Ashcombe stood in the doorway of that quiet room, with the rain coming sideways against the tall windows, and he did not move for a long time. A footman hovered behind him in the corridor, unsure whether to speak. The fire had gone to embers, but Adrian could still read the shape of the words in the ash, the loops of his own ink, the letters he had written her across 2 seasons of courtship and 1 of marriage. She had taken every one of them and fed them to the grate one by one. He crouched and lifted a fragment that the heat had only browned at the edge, and the corner of a single line survived. "Forgive me," it said, in his hand, not hers. The rest was gone. He turned the diary over in his hands, the little brass clasp held. He had given her that diary himself, the second week he knew her. A green leather book with her initials pressed into the cover in gold, and he had laughed and told her she could keep her secrets from the whole world, but never from him. She had kept them from him after all. He did not have the key. He would not break it open like a thief in his own house. He set it down exactly where she had left it, and he stood and he asked the footman, in a voice that came out level only because he had spent his whole life making it come out level, where the Duchess had gone. No one knew. That was the part that undid him quietly. In the chest, where no one could see it, the Duchess of Wexford had walked out of one of the great houses of England in the grey hour before dawn, and the grooms had not heard a carriage, and the maids had not been told, and the gatekeeper swore the gate had not opened. She had simply unstitched herself from his world and stepped through the seam and pulled it shut behind her, and the only message she had left was a grate full of ash and a book he could not read. He was 29 that spring. He would spend the next part of his life learning what it was to be a man whose wife had chosen to vanish rather than tell him one true thing. And the one true thing, the thing she carried out of that house under her cloak, against the cold, in the dark. He would not learn what it was for 6 years. By then the boy would be old enough to ask questions of his own. Let me take you back, because nothing about that morning makes sense until you know how a duke who could have married any heiress in the kingdom came to love a vicar's penniless ward, and how a girl with nothing came to burn the letters of the man who had given her everything. The how of it is the whole story. The why of it nearly ended them both. She had not been anyone when they met. That was the first cruelty the world had ready for her. Eleanor Vane was the orphaned ward of a country clergyman, taken into a great family's house that season only because the Countess of Harrowby had a soft and idle fondness for charitable projects, and a beautiful poor girl made a charming one. Eleanor had arrived at the Harrowby ball in a borrowed gown with the hem let down twice, and she had known, walking into that gilded room, exactly what she was to every person in it. She was the entertainment. She was the parable the great ladies told their daughters. Be grateful. Look at her. That is what becomes of a family that gambles its money away. Adrian saw her before she saw him. He was standing apart from the dancing, as he always did, because a duke who is not yet married is a problem to be solved, and every mother in the room was solving him. And across the floor, a girl in a too plain gown lifted her chin at something a passing matron said to her. He could not hear the words, but he saw the matron's mouth move and saw the girl take the blow and not flinch. saw her smile as if the cruelty had been a kindness and thank the woman, and turn away with her spine perfectly straight. Most people, when they are humiliated, fold. He had watched 100 ballrooms full of people fold. This girl had taken the blow standing, and the standing had cost her something, and she had paid it without letting anyone see her count the coin. That, more than her face, was what stopped him. He had spent his whole life surrounded by people performing for him, and here was someone performing for no one, holding herself together with nothing but will, because no one in the room would do it for her. "Who is that?" he asked the man beside him. "The vain girl. Harrowby's charity. No people, no money." "Pretty, though. Pity." The man said pity the way other men said it about a horse that had gone lame. And Adrian, who had been raised on that word and what it did to people, felt something in him take a quiet and dangerous turn. He crossed the room. The whole ball watched him cross it, because the Duke of Wexford crossing a ballroom was a piece of news, and he crossed it to a girl no one would have wagered a shilling on, and he bowed to her as he would have bowed to a queen, and he asked her to dance. She looked at him with green eyes that had gone very still, the way an animal goes still when it cannot tell whether a thing is a rescue or a trap. "Your Grace," she said, "I think you have mistaken me for someone you ought to dance with." "No," he said, "I have correctly identified the only person in this room I want to." It should have been a triumph for her, that dance. A duke had chosen her. Instead, the room read it as a duke amusing himself, and the kinder people pitied her more, and the unkind ones decided she was scheming. And a beautiful poor girl who has the attention of a powerful man learns within a single evening that the world will hate her either way, as the fool he is toying with, or as the schemer trapping him. There is no version where she wins by being chosen. There is only the version where she is blamed for it. Eleanor learned that lesson before the music stopped, and she filed it away, and 6 years later it would be the thing that drove her out a gate in the dark. But that night she danced with him, and he was not what she expected. She had braced for charm, for the practiced flattery of a man who collects, and instead the Duke of Wexford was awkward in a way that surprised her. Too direct, too honest. A man who had clearly decided long ago that the games of the ton were beneath answering and had simply stopped playing them, so that talking to him was like stepping out of a hot, crowded room into cold, clean air. He asked her real questions. He listened to the answers. When she said something sharp and true about the matron who had insulted her, he laughed, a real laugh, startled out of him, and several heads turned, because no one had heard the Duke of Wexford laugh in a long time. If you have come this far into Eleanor's story, take a moment to subscribe, because this channel exists for exactly this: the overlooked one, the bought one, the penniless girl the whole room wrote off, proven in the end to be the one worth choosing. If some part of you still believes that, then you already belong here, and the part I have been waiting to tell you is still to come. Stay with me. He courted her the way he did everything, without apology and without subtlety, in full view of a society that could not believe it. He sent letters. That was the thing the gossips fixed on first. The Duke of Wexford, who answered correspondence in 3 cold lines, was writing this nobody pages. He wrote in his own hand, no secretary, sealed with his own ring. And the letters were not the letters a careful man writes. They were reckless. They said things a duke is never supposed to commit to paper, things that could be read aloud in a drawing room to ruin him, and he sent them anyway and did not care who knew. Eleanor read each one in the window seat of her borrowed room and could not make herself believe them, and so she kept them. all of them, in a ribboned bundle at the bottom of her trunk, the only treasure she had ever owned. Those were the letters she would one day burn. His mother fought it. Of course his mother fought it. The Dowager Duchess of Wexford was a woman who had spent 40 years arranging the world to her satisfaction, and she had a particular arrangement in mind for her son, Lady Margaret Crane, the daughter of an old allied house, £30,000, and a bloodline the Dowager could recite to the conquest. When Adrian announced he meant to marry the vain girl, the Dowager did not shout. She was far too dangerous for shouting. She smiled, and she received Eleanor in her private sitting room, and over a pot of perfectly poured tea she explained to the girl, kindly, the way one explains a hard truth to a child, exactly what Eleanor was costing the man she loved. "He is not marrying a woman," the Dowager said. "He is marrying a war. Every door that opens for him now will close. The men he needs in the Lords will not seat their wives beside a vicar's foundling. His name will become a joke before it becomes a tragedy. He will tell you he does not care, and he will mean it for a year, perhaps 2. And then one morning he will look at the wreck of his consequence, and he will not say a word to you. He is far too good a man to say a word to you. And you will have to live the rest of your life across the breakfast table from a man too kind to tell you that you ruined him." She set down her cup. "I am not your enemy, child. I am the only person in this house telling you the truth." Eleanor went home and looked at the letters and understood that the Dowager had found the one fear she could not argue with, because it was her own. She had spent her whole life as the thing a great family carried at a loss. She knew exactly what it was to be a debt someone could not stop paying. She nearly ended it then. She had the bundle in her hands over the cold grate, the first time she ever meant to burn them, 6 years before she finally did. And then a letter came that she had not expected, and it was not from Adrian. It was from his steward, and it told her that the Duke had collapsed. He had a fever. The doctors used the word that everyone uses when they mean to say a man may die and dare not. And the household, which would not seat Eleanor at a table, sent for her at midnight, because the Duke in his fever would say no other name. She came. She nursed him through 9 days and nights in a sick room where the great family's rules did not reach. And on the worst night, when the fever broke and he opened his eyes and found her there, gray with exhaustion, holding his hand as if she could hold him in the world by main force, he said the only thing he had ever said that frightened her more than the Dowager's tea. "Don't ever leave," he said, "whatever it costs me, whatever they do. I would rather be ruined with you than safe without you. Promise me you won't decide for me what I can bear." She promised. She would break that promise. But she did not know it yet, and on the strength of it she married him, in a small, cold church, with his mother sitting like a monument in the front pew, and the whole of society waiting outside to begin the war the Dowager had foretold. The war came exactly as predicted. That is the cruelty of a true prophecy. It does not gloat, it simply arrives. The first season of their marriage, the invitations thinned. The men Adrian needed grew careful around him. A bill he had spent 2 years building support for in the Lords died for want of 3 votes that had been promised and quietly withdrawn, and a friend told him, not unkindly, over brandy, that it was the marriage. It was always going to be the marriage. That men did not like to be governed by a house that had made itself ridiculous for love. Adrian came home from that conversation and did not mention it, and Eleanor knew the moment he walked in that something had been taken from him, and she watched him decide not to tell her, and the Dowager's prophecy moved 1 inch closer to true. He never said a word to her. The dowager had been right about that too. He was too good a man to say a word. But Eleanor was not a fool, and a woman who has spent her whole life reading the faces of people who hold power over her becomes very good at reading the one face she loves. She watched the cost of her accumulate in him over 2 years, the way he stopped going to the Lord's, the way old friends became correspondents and correspondents became strangers, the way his mother's silences grew longer and more patient, the way the great clock of his consequence ran slower and slower towards stopping. He bore it without complaint. That was the worst of it. If he had complained, she could have argued. His silence she could not argue with, because his silence was a kindness, and you cannot fight a man's kindness without making yourself the villain of it. And then she learned she was carrying his child, and the fear that had lived in her since the dowager's sitting room stood up and put on a crown. Because a child changed the arithmetic. A childless duke who has ruined himself for love can recover, can let time and tact heal his name, can be forgiven as a man who made a young man's mistake. But a child of that marriage is forever. A child is the marriage made permanent, made bone, made heir. Once the boy was born, the war the dowager had promised would not be a season's scandal anymore. It would be the family's whole future. The child growing up the laughingstock heir of the duke who threw it all away, the title itself made a joke for 3 generations. Eleanor lay awake beside her sleeping husband with her hand on the small new weight of her belly, and understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who had always known the world's price, that she had become the thing she had feared most. She was no longer a debt Adrian could not stop paying. She was about to make that debt his son's. She told no one she was with child, not him. This is the hinge of everything, and I want you to hold it as she held it. She did not tell Adrian she was carrying his son, because she had done her arithmetic, the cold arithmetic she had learned at the bottom of other people's tables, and the answer it gave her was monstrous and, she believed, the only loving thing left to do. If she stayed, the boy would be born the heir of a ruined house, and Adrian would spend the rest of his life too kind to ever once let her see how much it had cost him, and she would spend hers watching the man she loved diminish by inches in a slow, good-mannered tragedy, both of them too tender to ever say the true thing aloud. But if she left, if she vanished, completely, no scandal of separation, no whispered estrangement, simply a duchess who disappeared and a husband free to have her quietly declared lost, then in time, Adrian could remarry. He could take the Lady Margaret his mother had always wanted, mend his name, get a proper heir of a proper house, and become again the man he had been born to be. And no one would ever know there had been another son. The boy would grow up safe and unknown and free, far from a title that would have crushed him, and Adrian would be saved. And the only person who had to be destroyed to do it was her. She chose to be the one destroyed. People will tell you that was wrong of her, that she stole his son, that she decided for the man the very thing he had begged her on his sickbed never to decide. They are right. It was wrong. It was the great wrong of her life, and she knew it was wrong even as she did it, and she did it anyway, because she loved him in the particular way of a person who has never once in her life been allowed to believe she was worth more to anyone than the trouble she caused. She could not believe she was worth his ruin. The not believing was the wound the world had given her at every table she had ever sat at as a charity, and the wound made the decision, and the decision broke them both. So on a gray morning before dawn, 8 months gone with his child and sick with the wrongness of it, the Duchess of Wexford took her bundle of his reckless letters up to her sitting room and burned them. Not out of anger, the opposite. She burned them because they were the proof of how much he had loved her, and she could not carry that proof into the life she was choosing. A small life, an invisible life, a life where she would be Mrs. Someone, a widow with a child, in a town no duke would ever ride through. She could not be a woman every day reading letters from the duke she had abandoned. So she fed them to the grate and watched his reckless, beautiful sentences curl black, and she kept only one thing back from the fire: the green leather diary he had given her, the one he could not open, because in it she had written the whole truth, the child, the reasoning, the love, all of it, and she set it on the mantel, turned to face the door. Some part of her, the part that was still 9 and 20 and still wanted to be found, set it where he would see it and turned it so its back was to him, locked so that he would have to choose, break it open like a thief, or trust her one final time and let her go. He let her go. That was the thing she had counted on, and the thing that broke her heart to be right about. He was too good to force the lock. So he never read it. So for 6 years he did not know there was a son. Adrian did not remarry. His mother could not understand it. The Lady Margaret was patient, then less patient, then married elsewhere. The dowager had handed her son a clean road back to everything, and he simply would not walk it. He searched for Eleanor instead, quietly, ruinously, year after year, men hired and sent to ports and posting houses and parish registers, a fortune spent following a woman who had made herself into smoke. The world that had pitied him for marrying her now pitied him for losing her, and he found he could not tell the difference between the two pities and stopped caring about either. He grew older in a way that had nothing to do with years. He kept her diary on his own writing desk, locked, turned to face him now, and some nights he held it and ran his thumb over the little brass clasp and did not open it, because opening it was the last thing he had not done, and as long as he had not done it there was still one door in the world he had not found her on the other side of, and so still one door where she might be alive. She was alive. She was 3 counties away, in a gray seaside town the great families never visited, and she was raising his son. His name was Thomas. She had not given him his father's name. That would have been a thread for anyone to follow, but she had given him his father's eyes, which she could not help, and his father's stubborn directness, which frightened her a little more each year. He was 5 now, going on 6, a grave, dark-haired boy who asked questions the way Adrian asked them, straight at the center of a thing, with no patience for the soft padding people put around hard truths. "Where is my father?" he had begun to ask. "Why don't I have one like the other boys?" And Eleanor, who had built her whole exile on a single necessary lie, found that the lie did not get easier to tell a child as the child got older. It got harder. It got unbearable. She told him his father had been a good man who died, and Thomas would look at her with Adrian's storm-gray eyes, and she could see him not believing her, the way Adrian had never quite believed a thing he was told until he had seen the truth of it himself. She had made a life. That was the thing she clung to on the nights the wrongness of it all came for her. She had taken in sewing, then better sewing, until she became the woman the town brought its wedding gowns to, and she had a small, clean rented house on a street that smelled of salt and wood smoke, and a son who was clever and kind, and not one single person there knew that the seamstress on Cooper Lane had once been the Duchess of Wexford. She had unmade herself completely. She was good at unmaking herself. She had been doing it her whole life. And then, on an ordinary gray Tuesday in the 6th year, a carriage that did not belong in that town came down the high street, and a man got out of it who did not belong there either, and Eleanor, standing in her own doorway with a basket of mending on her hip, looked up the lane and felt the whole carefully built structure of her exile go silent and still inside her, the way a house goes silent in the half-second before something falls. It was not Adrian. She would learn that in a moment, and the not being Adrian would be its own particular cruelty. The man getting out of the carriage was the Duke's steward, an older man named Hartley, whom she had known in her other life, who had grown gray in the years of searching, and who had not come to this town looking for her at all. He had come because the Duke had finally, after 6 years, given up, had instructed his men to close the search, to stop spending the fortune, to let the dead be dead. Hartley had come to this gray town on the coast on the very last errand of that closing down, to verify a record in a parish register and cross the final port off the final list, so that the Duke could at last declare his wife lost, and his mother could at last stop hoping, and the whole long ruinous chapter could end. He was crossing the high street toward the church to read a register, and he passed a seamstress in a doorway with a basket on her hip, and he glanced at her the way a tired man glances at a stranger. And then he stopped, because Hartley had spent 6 years memorizing one face from a portrait, and the seamstress had gone the color of ash, and she had taken one step backward into her doorway, and that single step backward, that flinch of a person who has been found, told the old steward everything the portrait had told him, and more. "Your Grace," he said, the street word. In that street, in that town, falling on a seamstress in a mended apron. She closed her eyes. What happened next happened fast, and it happened around Thomas, who came to the door at the sound of a strange man's voice and stood at his mother's hip, and looked up at the gray old gentleman with Adrian's exact storm-gray eyes, and Eleanor watched Hartley look down at the boy, and watched the old man do the arithmetic she had done 6 years before, watched him land on the answer, and watched the answer take the strength out of his knees so that he put a hand against her doorframe to stay upright. The Duke had a son, the Duke who had just that month given up, who had just that month decided his life was over. The Duke had a son, alive, 3 counties away, with his own gray eyes, in a doorway that smelled of salt. "He cannot know," Eleanor said. Her voice came out low and fierce and shaking. "Hartley, listen to me. He has built a life. The boy is safe. If you tell him, you undo everything. Please, I am begging you. Let the dead stay dead." And the old steward, who loved his master and had spent 6 years watching that master come apart slowly over the loss of her, looked at the woman who had caused it all, and the boy who would heal it all, and said the truest thing anyone said in the whole story. "No, Your Grace," he said gently. "I have carried that man's grief for 6 years. I will not carry his son's absence on top of it. You decided once that you knew better than he did what he could bear. You were wrong. And I think, somewhere under all of this, you have always known you were wrong, or you would not have kept the diary." She had kept the diary. Of course she had kept the diary. She had carried it through 6 years and 4 lodgings, and never once been able to make herself burn the one thing that held the whole truth, the way you cannot burn the only confession you have ever made. Hartley was right, and she knew he was right, and the knowing dropped her. Finally, after 6 years of holding herself perfectly straight at the world's cruel tables, it dropped her down onto the doorstep of her little rented house with her son's arms around her neck, and she wept the way she had not let herself weep since the morning she walked out the gate. Adrian came on the 3rd day. She had not run. That was its own kind of surrender and its own kind of courage. She could have taken Thomas and vanished again. She was, after all, the best in England at vanishing. But Hartley's words had gone into her like a key into a lock she had been pretending for 6 years she did not have. And she found she could not do it again. She could not make her son into smoke the way she had made herself into smoke. So she waited, in the small house on Cooper Lane, with the diary on the table between 2 chairs turned to face the door. He came in out of the rain. 6 years had marked him. She saw that first, before anything, the gray at his temples, the lines the searching had cut, the carefulness in him of a man who has taught himself not to hope, because hoping has only ever cost him. He stood in her small doorway, exactly as he had once stood in the doorway of her sitting room over a grate full of ash, and for a long moment neither of them could find a single word in a language they had both once spoken fluently to each other and to no one else. Then Thomas came out of the back room to see who his mother was staring at, and the Duke of Wexford saw his son for the first time. And the boy and the man looked at each other with the same gray eyes across a small rented room. And whatever Adrian had braced himself to feel, he had not braced himself for that. He went down. Not gracefully. A duke does not go down on one knee on a seamstress's floor with any grace. He simply could not keep standing. And so he was kneeling, level with the boy. And the boy studied him with that grave, straight directness, and then said the thing that ended 6 years. "You have my eyes," Thomas said. "Yes," Adrian managed. "I believe I do." "Mama said my father died." And Adrian, who had every right in that moment to turn and look at the woman who had told his son he was dead, who had stolen 6 years and a christening and a first word and a first step, did not look at her at all. He looked at his son and he said, "Your mother was protecting you from something she was afraid of." Grown people do frightening things when they are afraid. "But I am not dead, Thomas. I have been looking for you both for a very long time. I just did not know to look for you. It was only then," with the boy's small hand having crept into his, that he stood and faced Eleanor, and the thing in his face was not the rage she had spent 6 years certain she deserved. It was worse. It was bewilderment. 6 years, he said. "Eleanor, 6 years. There is a son. Why? What could I possibly have done, what could anyone have done, that you would rather make me a man who lost his wife and his child than tell me one true thing? You did nothing." Her voice broke on it. "That was the whole horror of it, Adrian. You did nothing. You only loved me, and it was ruining you, and you were too good to ever once let me see it cost you. And I could not. I have never in my life been worth what I cost the people who kept me. I could not be the thing that ruined you, and then make our son the thing that ruined you forever. So I made myself a debt you could finally stop paying. I thought I was saving you by deciding for me." His voice was very quiet. The one thing I asked you, on what I thought was my deathbed, never to do. You promised me you would never decide for me what I could bear." He shook his head slowly. "You did not save me, Eleanor. You only made the decision I had already refused to make. I weighed it all. The Lord's, my name, my mother, the whole gilded ruin of my consequence. I weighed it against you. And I chose you, openly, in front of the world, on purpose. It was the one decision in my whole life I made completely free. And you took it back from me in the dark and called it love." There was no defending it. She did not try. She crossed the little room instead, and she picked up the green leather diary from the table, and she took the small key from where it had hung against her heart on a chain for 6 years. She had never been able to part with the key either, and she unlocked the clasp herself. the clasp he had been too good to break for 6 years, and she put the open book into his hands. "Everything I could not say is in here," she said. "I wrote it all down the way other women say it aloud. Read it, and then decide what I am to you. You have earned the deciding. I took 6 years of decisions from you. This one is yours." He read it that night, in a room at the only inn the gray town had, while his son slept and the rain went on against the glass. He read all 6 years of it, the page she had written 8 months gone, the cold, monstrous, loving arithmetic in her small, even hand, where she explained to a husband who would never read it exactly why she had to make him hate her, and how much she hoped he never would. The page from her first night in the gray town, alone with a newborn and no money and no name, that held only one line, "I have done the right thing, and I will never forgive myself for it." Somewhere in the middle of the night, the bewilderment in him turned into something quieter and harder to bear, which was understanding. He had wanted, on the ride up, to be owed an apology. By dawn he understood that you cannot be owed an apology by someone who has already sentenced herself to a longer punishment than you could ever have devised. She had not run from his love. She had run because she could not believe she was permitted to keep it. And the world had taught her that, table by table, every great lady who had ever called her a charity and meant a debt. He understood, finally, that the person who had ruined Eleanor was not Eleanor, and he knew exactly whose drawing room the ruin had been poured out in over a perfectly good pot of tea. He took them home. Not quietly. He was done, forever, with doing the merciful, necessary thing quietly, because he had watched quietness cost him 6 years. He brought the seamstress of Cooper Lane and her grave, gray-eyed boy back to the great house, in a coach with the Wexford arms on the door, in full view of a society that had spent 6 years deciding the Duke was tragic, and he let them decide instead that the Duke was mad, and he did not care, because his son was holding his hand and asking him the names of all the horses. The Dowager was waiting in the long gallery when they arrived, because someone always tells the Dowager. She had aged into something formidable and brittle. 40 years of arranging the world hardened into a woman who had nearly gotten the last arrangement she wanted. Her son free, the foundling gone, the slate clean, and here was the foundling back, with a child who had the Ashcombe eyes and the whole clean future cracking in front of her. She looked at Thomas, and she went white, because the boy was the proof of everything she had spent 6 years pretending had never happened. "Adrian," she said. "Whatever this woman has told you, she told me nothing," Adrian said. "She has never told me anything. That was always the trouble. You, however, told her a great deal. In your sitting room, over tea." He did not raise his voice. He had learned, at last, that the level voice was more terrible than the loud one, the same way his silence had once been more terrible than any reproach. "You told my wife, when she was a frightened girl with no one in the world, that she was a war I had married, and that she would have to live across the breakfast table from a man too kind to tell her she had ruined him. You found the one fear she could not survive, and you fed it to her, gently, year after year, until she did the only thing your arithmetic left her. She removed herself, and she took my son away to a town that smells of fish so that you could have your clean future. You did not protect this family, Mother. You hollowed it out, and called the hollow a rescue. I have spent 6 years learning what that costs. I do not recommend it." It was the Dowager who broke the silence, and what she said was not a defense. Something in her old hard face had come undone looking at the boy. "I thought," she said, very low, "that I was saving you." "Yes," Adrian said. That is exactly what she thought too. You taught it to her. The two of you, between you, were so busy saving me that no one ever once asked me what I wanted saved. He let that sit. I wanted them. I have only ever wanted them. And the both of you decided in your great love that I could not be trusted with the one thing I asked for. I am the Duke of Wexford. I have decided to be trusted with my own life now. You may make your peace with that, or you may have the dower house at Hartfield, which is very comfortable and very far away. The dowager looked at her grandson a long moment. Then she did the only thing left to a woman who has run out of arrangements. She knelt stiffly on her own gallery floor, level with the boy, the way Adrian had knelt on the seamstress's floor, and she looked into the ashcombe eyes she had tried to erase, and she said, "How do you do, Thomas? I am your grandmother. I have been a very foolish old woman, and I am sorry." And Thomas, who had his mother's mercy as well as his father's eyes, considered her gravely and decided, the way children decide, to forgive a stranger faster than any adult ever could. The tun did what the tun does. It gossiped, and it waited for the Duke to be ashamed. And the Duke was not ashamed, and after a while a thing that refuses to be ashamed stops being a scandal and starts being simply true. The lost Duchess had been found. There was an heir. The story was too strange and too tender to stay cruel, and society, which had hated Eleanor as a fool and a schemer, found it did not have a name ready for a woman who had ruined herself trying to give a duke back his consequence. And a world that has no name for you cannot easily go on despising you. She came back into that gilded room on Adrian's arm in a crimson gown, with her chin lifted the way it had been lifted the first night under the matron's cruelty, and she did not beg a single person's pardon, and the room that had laughed at her 6 years before grew quiet, because a woman who has been to the bottom of her own worst decision and walked back up out of it carrying her son is not a thing a drawing-room knows how to mock. She answered them with the same composure she had always answered the world with, and the composure turned the room on its axis. The whisper went around that the Duchess of Wexford had a quality the Lady Margaret never had, and no one could quite name it, and the not being able to name it was her whole revenge. Adrian had the letters reprinted. That was the part Eleanor wept over. Much later he had kept copies, all those years, of the reckless, ruinous letters he had written her in his own hand, the ones she had burned. He had them copied fresh and bound in green leather to match the diary, and he gave them back to her on the first anniversary of her coming home, so that the fire would not have the last word. "You burned the proof that I loved you," he said, "because you could not believe it. So I am going to keep giving it back to you for the rest of your life, until believing it is simply a thing you do without trying." And he set the new bundle beside the old green diary on the mantel of her sitting room. The same kind of mantel, the same kind of grate, and this time he turned the diary to face the room, unlocked, its small key on a ribbon beside it, because there were no secrets left in it that needed keeping, and a book that needs no lock is the only kind worth giving someone you love. Thomas grew up at Wexford with his father's eyes and his mother's mercy, and a grandmother who spoiled him outrageously to make up for a year she could not give back. He learned, eventually, the whole strange story of how he came to smell of salt for the first 5 years of his life, and being his father's son, he asked it straight at the center, and being his mother's son, he understood it. And he did not hate anyone for it, because everyone in it had been trying badly in the broken way that frightened people try to love each other. Here is the thing the green diary said on its last filled page, the one Eleanor wrote the night she came home, and I will give it to you the way she wrote it. "We spend our whole lives, some of us, being told what we are worth by people who are only guessing. And if we are not careful, we begin to do their guessing for them. And we make ourselves small to spare the people we love the trouble of us. And we call it kindness, when it is only fear wearing kindness's coat. The bravest thing she ever did was not vanishing. Anyone frightened enough can vanish. The bravest thing was unlocking the book and putting it in his hands and letting another person decide, at last, that she was worth keeping, and then believing him when he did. So here is the question I will leave you with tonight. If you had been Eleanor, 8 months gone, certain to the bone that your love was ruining the one man who had ever chosen you, would you have stayed and let him pay the cost with his eyes open, trusting that he meant it when he said he chose it? Or would you have done what she did and walked out the gate in the dark to save him from a choice he had already made? There is a green book on a mantel somewhere that knows which one of those is love. I am not certain I do. Tell me which one you would have been.